This time the criminal case is very interesting. A rich man suddenly disappeared while celebrating his wife's birthday on a small island. What really happened? Here is the full story of the criminal case. A man named Mark Weinberger, 41 years old at the time of the incident. He is a doctor and has also been married to a beautiful woman. His wife is named Michelle Kramer, who is 30 years old. One day Mark and Michelle went on vacation to a small island, namely Greece Island. And at that time they used their private yacht to celebrate Michelle's 30th birthday. On September 21st in 2004, at 6 a.m. Michelle woke up that day but did not see her husband in bed. She thought her husband had gone out for a morning run, and Michelle changed clothes and immediately looked for her husband on the road. The island was very small, and there were not many places for them to go out, so Michelle searched around the island while asking people around. After hours, Michelle did not find her husband. Now she began to panic because she was afraid that her husband would get into trouble there. When Michelle asked the captain of the ship, the captain said that Mark was preparing a party and he would be back before sunset. Michelle now remembered Mark's words the night before, where Mark asked if Michelle really loved him. And when Mark heard that Michelle really loved him, Mark said that he would prepare the most festive party that she would never forget in her life. Mark that night promised to call all the famous artists to give her birthday greetings. For Michelle, Mark's words were nothing new because Mark often gave unexpected surprises. Mark would buy jewelry and very expensive items for his wife, Michelle. Mark is a millionaire who works as a surgeon. He comes from Indiana, while Michelle was born in Chicago from an ordinary family. Before marrying Mark, Michelle was a hard-working woman. When she was 25, she met Mark in Chicago. According to Michelle, Mark is a very charismatic man. He is also very loving. After knowing each other for a week, Mark invited Michelle to go to Miami on his yacht. Her parents supported their daughter's relationship with Mark because they thought Mark was more mature and financially stable. So they believed that Michelle would have a better life. They got married in a small church in Italy. And after the wedding, Michelle's life changed like a princess in a fairy tale. After 12 hours, Michelle waited for Mark, but Mark did not return. Now Michelle asked the captain of the ship again, where Mark actually went. The captain told Michelle to sit down, and there he said that Mark had left and he would not come back again. Michelle was very shocked. The captain said that Mark had just called him. Michelle immediately called Mark using the captain's cell phone, and on the phone line, Mark answered Michelle's call. But after Mark heard Michelle's voice, he immediately hung up the phone. The next day, Michelle contacted Mark's assistant at the clinic in Indiana, Suzette Dunnington. She said that Mark had just called her and asked about her work at the clinic, just like any other day. Michelle couldn't digest the reality that Mark had just given her. Why did he have to just leave her when she felt like she had no problems with Mark? According to Michelle, their relationship is fine. Even Mark always praises her as a good wife. She is Mark's ideal wife. Michelle is now starting to think about what really happened. Who is Mark really? Mark doesn't tell much about his past or work or even about his family. So with Mark's disappearance, Michelle now wants to do her own investigation to find out who the man who married her really is. Michelle began to look for the file documents in her husband's clinic. There she found several files of lawsuits from her patients a year before Mark disappeared, where her husband was sued for performing surgery that should not have been done to the patient. Michelle there still suspected that it was the work of her patient who only wanted to destroy her husband's career, or the patient wanted to get more compensation from her husband's clinic. 6 days after Mark did not return home, Michelle decided to return to Chicago. Michelle checked Mark's phone call list. There she found that Mark often called the New York area. She then called the number, and it turned out that the number belonged to a man selling diamonds. The man said that Mark often came to New York just to buy his diamonds, and he did it at lunchtime. Usually Mark will use his private jet from Indiana and he will fly on the same day. Michelle was very surprised by the man's words because Mark never told her about it. A little information: usually diamonds are a currency for criminals to exchange their money without a trace. Michelle kept looking for something in her husband's office. There she found a piece of paper from the machine. Michelle put the papers together to find out what document her husband had destroyed. It turned out that there was a paper written by Mark. There, Mark wrote the name of a hotel in Paris. Without thinking, Michelle immediately flew to Paris to go to the hotel. When she arrived at the hotel, the receptionist said that it was true that Mark had booked the hotel. However, Mark had checked out the day before Michelle arrived. The receptionist also said that Mark sat at the bar every night and enjoyed drinks and food at the hotel. And according to the people there, Mark was alone without anyone accompanying him. Michelle just realized that Mark did leave on his own accord, and he did not run away because of danger or because of a threat. But what Michelle still can't accept is why Mark had to do that behind her back. Even though they never had any problems, Michelle still wants to find out why Mark left her. Mark's nurse and assistant at the clinic also experienced the same thing as Michelle. Because at the clinic, there were already many patients waiting for Mark. Suzette also had no words to explain to the patients why Mark left the clinic. Suzette called Mark 24 hours a day for days. Suzette barely slept just to find out where Mark was. 2 weeks after Mark left Michelle, 2 strange men appeared at Mark's clinic. They were from the bank. There, the 2 men told Suzette that if Mark did not contact the bank that afternoon, they would close the clinic because it turned out that Mark had taken money from the bank and he used the clinic as collateral. That day, Mark's clinic and the 40 employees in it were forcibly removed, and the clinic was finally forcibly closed by the bank. Meanwhile, no one knows about Mark's whereabouts. Mark is known to have built the clinic for 2 years, since 2002, and from the clinic Mark has pocketed millions of dollars from his patients. Mark chose a very specific place to build his clinic, which is near a factory called Gary, and the factory is known to be very polluted, and Mark is the only sinus specialist in the area. Mark also chose the place because all workers in the factory have health insurance. So Mark has targeted and arranged everything very neatly. Mark has also pocketed several diplomas from several universities until finally he became a specialist doctor from the clinic. In a year, Mark can pocket money of $14 million, which allows him to have a very luxurious life with his wife, Michelle. Michelle said that her husband has 5 mansion houses on the beach with 3 different personal drivers. Mark also has a personal massage therapist. According to Michelle, they also have a yacht parked next to Bill Gates' ship. Mark also has a private jet that will take him around the United States. Michelle has no idea what Mark is doing in the office or at the clinic, because Michelle is busy with her glamorous life as a princess. Now that the clinic has been closed, Michelle has learned that the malpractice at her husband's clinic was not just gossip. Ken Allen, an Indiana attorney, has filed a complaint to the court about Dr. Mark and his clinic in 2002. The attorney received complaints from Mark's patients. At that time, Mark advised them to have surgery even though it was not necessary. Even those who do not have sinus disease are diagnosed by Dr. Mark with chronic sinus, until finally they are required to undergo surgery. Mark takes the trust of his patients so that they pay more, and most of his patients follow what Mark says, until many of his patients experience complications. Mark could perform 10 operations per day on patients, and each patient they would pay around $10,000 to $30,000 US. Mark would only need 20 to 30 minutes to perform the operation on each patient. A month before Mark disappeared, a doctor contacted the medical center that had given permission to doctors in the area. He told them to check on Dr. Mark and also into his clinic. After receiving the report, the medical center finally came to Mark's clinic. After that, Mark started to get confused about what to do, but he just told his wife that he was very tired at work. It turned out that Mark's patient named Phyllis Barnes died as a result of surgery by Mark, and that made Mark even more panicked with the pressure from all parties. According to Michelle, he started drinking alcohol at home and started smoking outside. Meanwhile, according to people who know Mark, he is a very smart man. Since childhood, he has always achieved and had a healthy life. Phyllis had sinus for a long time, and she always coughed because she was a heavy smoker. But in 2001, Phyllis came to Mark's clinic and she started consulting. Mark didn't do a CT scan or check it first, but Mark immediately wanted to do the surgery. And there Phyllis was asked to pay several $1,000s for her sinus surgery. 20 minutes later, Phyllis came out of the operating room. But a month later, Phyllis' condition was still the same. and 2 months later, Phyllis experienced complications. Until one night her son saw his mother could not breathe. He then called emergency help and took his mother to the hospital. And for a week, Phyllis was in a coma. It turned out after tests, Phyllis did not have sinus disease, but she had stage 4 cancer in her throat. After Phyllis underwent chemo and recovered, she finally died on September 16, 2004. After Mark got the news that Phyllis died, a week later Mark disappeared without a trace. In February 2004, 2 months after Mark disappeared, Michelle found that Mark was still using his credit card. Michelle kept an eye on where Mark went and what he bought with the credit card. One day, Michelle received a notification that Mark used her credit card to buy a train ticket to Paris. Without thinking, Michelle immediately flew to Paris to find Mark. At that time, Mark fled to France with the proceeds of his malpractice. However, when Michelle arrived in Paris, she could not find Mark because Mark stopped using the credit card. Mark has taken all the money from his clinic and then he exchanged it for diamond. And Michelle also just realized that her savings are now empty and there is no money left there. It turns out that Michelle has been prohibited from buying property assets in her name. Another bitter fact is that it turns out that all the houses, cars, and yachts are not Mark's, but Mark only rents them. Michelle then decided to file a divorce letter to her husband. Several years later, Michelle still had no information about Mark's whereabouts. In December of 2006, the court in Indiana managed to gather all the evidence to bring Mark to trial. There, Mark was charged with 22 counts of misuse of practice license, fraud, and also health insurance misuse. Mark's face is in the American Criminal Database Interpol and also around the world. Initial investigations said that Mark is in China, Puerto Rico, or in Israel. But for years, Mark has not shown any signal about where his real whereabouts are. There are also those who argue that it is possible that he already has a new identity or changes his facial appearance. One day, a woman named Monica Spicagna, who is a small shop owner, meets a very charismatic man. The man says that he is from New York City and his name is Mark. Mark said that he was a widower with no children and was retired. He had enough money for him to live outside for the rest of his life. Mark and Monica had a very fast connection until they finally became close. Monica at that time had hobbies and activities outside the house. And Mark also seemed to want to spend the rest of his life just hanging out with nature because he would not be able to mingle with people in public. They both have activities together. And finally, they become a couple. Monica turns out to be a transgender woman. After knowing this, Mark still accepts her well. For more than a year, Mark and Monica lived together. But in 2009, Mark told Monica that he wanted to spend his time only with nature. He didn't want to live in Monica's house anymore. Mark will start his new life. Mark decided to live in a tent that he set up on the slopes of an Italian mountain. Monica was very worried because there were often snowstorms there. But Mark didn't seem to care anymore. All he wanted was to enjoy his life with nature. Monica sent food and things that Mark needed there. And Mark has never been in public at all during that time. According to Monica, Mark is really enjoying his life. 3 months after Mark decided to live in a tent, Monica got a call from her friend that Monica was going to be in big trouble. Monica's friend said that Mark was not who he said he was. Mark had been on the run for more than 4 years, and now Monica knows who he really is. Monica immediately went to the police station to report Mark's whereabouts. That day there was a snowstorm, and the weather was also very bad. However, the local police decided to pick up Mark that day. After they found Mark's tent, their Mark looked very calm and also very cooperative with the police. It turned out that their Mark did not have a single identity card. And if he died there, no one would know who Mark really was. 6 months after his pickup that day, in January of 2009, the Italian government arranged for Mark's extradition to be sent to the United States. Michelle immediately got news of Mark's arrival in the United States. She also followed the case. Mark was immediately put in a prison cell, and Mark's case took years to bring him to justice. In March 2011, the case of Barnes' death finally went to court. And in court, Mark denied all charges. There, The judge found Mark guilty, and Mark was required to pay a fine of $1 million for the death of Phyllis Barnes. Mark also had to pay a fine to other patients of $55 million. However, at the end of the trial, the judge only sentenced Mark to 4 years in prison. And after a retrial, Mark was finally sentenced to 7 years in prison. Mark was declared free in January 2015. Then the patient and Michelle did not accept the sentence. However, according to the judge, the 7-year sentence was what Mark deserved. That's all for today's case. Don't forget to leave your comments about this case. And if you don't mind, click the subscribe button to support our channel. Thank you to you subscribers. That's all. See you in the next case.